Specialized Business Solutions, and we appreciate you coming. So this is Keystroke Live, 10 a.m. every Wednesday, same log on information. We talked a lot about PCI and our pa-dss implementation guide last week, and so that was kind of required training for our pa-dss validation. And just as we throw all these letters around, kind of review what we're talking about, there's PCI, that's the payment card industry, and the PCI Security Standards Council, that's PCI-SSC. PCI was created by Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express, and then it has a variety of companies, everyone from British Airways to Walmart to RSPA sitting on the board of the council. They set up the PCI DSS standard for merchants and the pa-dss standard for us, that's payment applications. And when we talk about payment card security, there's different elements of that actual card itself. There's the sensitive authentication data, that's the SAD, which is the actual magnetic stripe reading on the back of the card with all that other information. There is a PIN number for PIN debit, card verification code, which can be CVV2, CVV, CVC, depending on the card brand. They call it different things, but it's the 4 digits on the front of an Amex or 3 digits on the back of other cards. And then the PAN is the primary account number, which is the actual 16-digit account number for Visa, MasterCard, or Discover, 15-digit account number for American Express. So when you look at PCI stuff, they'll talk about, oh, is it sensitive authentication data or PAN? And that's different. That's track data and account number. So it's a little different. To help out with the PCI compliance, there are QSA, Qualified Security Assessor for merchants, for people looking at PCI DSS. There's the PA-QSA for guys like us. And then there are authorized scanning vendors. That's the ASV they might talk about. That's somebody that can go and check the intrusion for all of that. And then the QIR at the bottom, that could be you if you pay them $5,000 or $10,000 and take their tests. You can be a qualified integrator and reseller. So PCI really, and I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody so I can. We don't get any trees getting cut down in the background or anything. And then if you have a question, you can enter it in the chat, or we'll open it up at the end. So PCI, there's like 3 or 4 really big things that embrace the security. There's this new EMV that we're all talking about. EMV does one thing, which prevents a merchant from taking a fraudulent card. So in other words, what it does is it makes it really difficult to make a fake card. It's not just a magnetic stripe that you can buy a magnetic stripe programmer for $400 or $500. It's actually messing with that chip. So it makes it much more difficult to take a fraudulent card. If you're a tourist shop and you've got all kinds of different people that you only see once coming in, it could be very applicable. If you are doing pool service for different homes throughout a community, really any credit cards you take are going to be from known entities, from people you know, so it's a very slim chance of taking a fraudulent card. So could be very effective for some people and really not that pertinent to other people's. They talk about the liability shift in October, where liability for a transaction done with a fraudulent card is transferred from the card brand, Visa, MasterCard, Discover, to the acquiring bank, which trickles down basically to the merchant. So the merchant is responsible for that. A lot of times you get a chargeback, and the merchant is responsible anyway because they didn't get a validated signature and can't necessarily prove to the card brands that they checked the signature and all of that. So a lot of times it ends up on the merchant anyway right now just because of procedure. But that is what that liability shift is. It's not something they have to do. It's going to be interesting to see how quickly things get shifted over, what the reaction to the public is, because I think that's a lot of what is going to drive it. If the public wants and desires EMV everywhere they go, it's going to put more pressure on merchants to get EMV devices in there. If they're a little resistant about, you have to, they call it dipping your card, is when you put it in the EMV reader, but you have to do that at the beginning of the transaction and leave it in there until the transaction is complete, because there's reading and writing going on to that chip on the card. So if consumers are resistant to that leaving the card in there, it could slow the adoption of EMV, but it's kind of a wait and see until we get to October. Following the PCI DSS procedures is designed to help prevent a data breach, to help prevent skimming or employee stealing data. So that's why the PCI DSS is all in play. Then you have the end-to-end or point-to-point encryption that again helps protect that cardholder data, helps prevent a breach, and tokenization goes hand in hand with the end-to-end or point-to-point encryption, that it masks the card data, so you're never even if you did get a breach, they're just getting mock card numbers, not real ones. So all of those combined can help with to create a very secure system. And remember, even if you are what they call out of scope, like with the Cayenne Genius or Mercury ISC 250, where you have tokenization and end-to-end encryption, there still are parts of PCI DSS that you need to follow. So there's 12 points, that takes care of 2 or 3 of the 12, but there still are other points that you need to do in a secure payment processing environment. Remember, again, we talk about all this, and there's a lot of detail last week. If you didn't get to see it, it's on YouTube. I sent an email with a link to the video. It's good to see because it kind of covers A to Z, everything related to keystroke that you need to know. But remember, the goal is security. You don't want to have a breach. You don't want to take fraudulent cards. And if you're thinking, okay, how can we design our procedures, our store setup so that that doesn't happen, that's really what everyone is after here. There's a lot of jumping through hoops with PCI, and I know that well because of our pa-dss validation. But again, the goal is security, and even going through all of that, we are becoming a more secure solution. PCI Security Council in general is very wary of wireless networks and remote access. So it's just something to make sure you're doing securely. If you did have a breach and there was wireless access or sketchy remote connections, they're not going to like that, and then the fine gets larger because you weren't following the spirit of their guidelines. So it's just something to be aware of. I know people need to do it, but especially with the wireless networks and remote connections, you need to follow the password guidelines. The story kind of that a lot of the people in the PCI industry and security industry throw around is the people have wireless networks, they've got WEP2 enabled and are using a key, but on the actual wireless access point, they never change the username and password. So if a hacker can get at that IP that's the access point, they can log in with admin and password, change the web key, and then have access to all your data and be able to get on the network and all of that. And that's kind of a story that's happened a few times. So the password guidelines seem overly complex, but a lot of it is just common sense of changing default passwords, and whether it's a firewall or a wireless access point, not only to put in a key to access it wirelessly, but also remember that default admin and password, or if you use Netgear routers, it can be Netgear and password for the username and password. Be sure to change those. It also regards to keystroke, that you need to use those passwords, and if you have administrator functions, to change them every 3 months. It applies to logging on to networks, applies to PC charge, logging on to workstations. You want to be sure you've got that security in place. And then lastly, there is a big part of PCI, and especially they beefed it up in 3.0, is to have some written policies and guidelines. Last week we talked about there was a key management document that somebody should sign if they're in charge of changing encryption keys. There's training materials that you would give to a new clerk, that you would give to people with administrator responsibilities. There's guidelines on what you do if you have a data breach, how you lock down your building and secure your data server at night when the store's closed, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of documentation that they want to see existing, and a lot of it is stuff that everybody knows and does anyway. They just want to see it written down. It doesn't have to be super complicated, but it's good to have that policy in place. It's what PCI is looking for. New in the PCI DSS 3.0, which is, remember, we've gone from 1.0, 1.2, 2.0, and now we're at 3.0, is they want you to maintain an inventory of system components. That's computers, pin pads, firewalls, all of that. And a lot of it is because of substitution, that somebody can switch out a firewall or something, and they want you to realize that. They want to know, they want you to be aware of everything that's in the system, so merchants aren't like, oh, I didn't know that wireless access point was there, or I didn't know that firewall had NAT translation turned off. That everything is accounted for and maintained. Antivirus solutions not only need to be on all machines, they need to be running, and they need to be set up so that you can't turn them off or disable them. Kind of a tricky requirement there, but they are very concerned with antivirus. There's also something in there about maintaining awareness of current vulnerabilities that are out there, and it's something, as a software developer, we do a lot of trolling on websites, whether it's Microsoft or different security company websites, to see, hey, what threats have been identified, how vulnerable are we to them, and you know, with a lot of what we have in place, we're not vulnerable to them, but you want to be aware of what's out there so you can be ready for what's coming. You need to protect devices that capture payments. That's basically the pin pad or the card swipe from tampering and substitution. The requirement is that at a set period of time, they're not big on saying whether that's a month or 3 months or 6 months or a year, that you inspect the devices, double check the serial numbers, make sure they haven't been tampered with, substitute. That's the target breach, was the pin pads got substituted. There was a extra layer put on top of the pin pads that captured the data that accelerated that breach. So it's a big thing that they have added to the PCI requirements. And then lastly is change controls, and that covers a whole lot of changes in 3.0 that weren't there in 2.0. And what that basically is involving is, if you fire an employee, you need to have a procedure and a control to eliminate their access to anything where payment card data might be stored. And that's where, yeah, we took their key to the front door away, we deleted them as a user, we took their passwords out, anything else that that person knew about our system we changed, so that they want to have that in there. And then there's also change controls about if you change a server, if you change access to things, that you've got some control so that you don't leave it open so that a hacker might get in, and two, that you don't open it up to someone that's not authorized to be within that data. So along with these, there's also a lot of documentation requirements that were beefed up in 3.0, a lot of having the training guides and company policy they want you to keep having, and they try to clarify that. There's some more information about vulnerability scans that merchants should have quarterly. I don't know if that's a little bit of overkill. It's not mandated that they have that, but that's basically having a third party go to their external IP address and see what they can see on their network to make sure it's not vulnerable to data attacks. So there's a lot to PCI. Remember, it's a state of mind, it's security. There's a lot of people that they go through the rigmarole of doing the SAQs. Those are the self-assessment questionnaires that you can get from PCI, and that you can do all that, and the next week you swap out a router and change something and you're no longer compliant. It's a state of mind, it's a day-to-day thing, which is, rather than looking at all the individual requirements, if you kind of use common sense and say, hey, how can we be most secure, that is the best way to do things. They say, oh, well, if you're not doing anything electronically, if you're using a knuckle buster and whatever, then you don't fall under PCI because you're not transmitting it. But nobody does that anymore. So that's why we need the EMV combined with that end-to-end or point-to-point encryption and tokenization to provide a truly secure solution. Another big issue, and I didn't put it on here, was the systems and software are supposed to be maintained and up to date with all security patches. So that's not only your virus scan, your operating system, it's Keystroke as well. And we do update Keystroke and KeyPay often, and we do that to keep up with requirements, any validations that we are getting. Version 8, as we kind of talked about last week, in KeyPay, it's got a lot of new security features. You can change the key. The data is encrypted a little more rigorously with data encryption keys, and then the key for that is encrypted with a key encryption key. So it's very secure, and it's good to keep up with that in Keystroke, but also with operating systems and virus software all needs to be kept up to date. Which, speaking of up to date, today is July 15th, 2015, and it is the last day for Windows 2003 Server. So after today, there are no longer security updates, and there's a lot of businesses, and a lot of larger businesses, that are using Windows 2003, and the upgrade path is a little bit difficult, but there's speculation on what kind of security vulnerabilities are going to open up in it due to the fact that it's reached end of life and a lot of people are still using it. So you want to be sure you are keeping up with those updates, that you're keeping up with what security threats are out there so that you can maintain a secure environment for your customers and your own payment processing when necessary. And thanks for attending. I am going to unmute everyone now. And are there any questions? Hopefully I did unmute everyone.
I think so.
Well, good. Well, thank you so much for attending and hearing me go on about the PCI. I've been kind of living it day in, day out for the past year, trying to get our pa-dss validation that is in process and review at TrustWave now, and hopefully will get submitted to the council shortly. So we've been working long and hard. Mike Gebbs put a lot of time into updating software, and we will see that soon. So to follow up all our talk about processing payments, we're going to talk about payment types next week, and then security levels the week after. So be sure to tune in for Mike Tabor next week, and thanks again for coming today.